Okay, so welcome to Culture Shock. Another week, another Tuesday, 3 p.m. And well, here we are with all the guests, our guests and all the hosts, right? So here we are,
Willie,
Alan,
Carla,
and Nathaniel.
and of course our second-time guest, Dr.
Michael.
Tuniniati. Yes, good. We're happy to have you back.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
That's very good. And yeah.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so this week we have a show prepared on world literature, and we'll have also the Vox Populi on that. I want to listen to that because it sounds interesting. Like what did students say? What the school population said about travel literature, and of course we have our expert on the topic. Well, experts. Both, by the way, yes, yeah. And well, I hope this will be very enriching for everyone who's listening and for us at the same time, right?
And it also we'll also be talking about culture shock, right? The title of the show, but also we'll be talking about intercultural communication, culture shock, and these things are all connected. So
which was very interesting, right? Like we have when we were planning this show, we were like, okay, yeah, it's travel literature, but when we started digging into it, it was like, okay, so culture shock is part of this. It has to be part of this. So that's what made it even more interesting. And well, let's get started.
So I was gone last week, but you, Dr. Tuniniati, were giving a seminar, a taller on. So your area of expertise in your work is travel literature, but you were also giving a taller to some of our students here.
Yeah, the workshop also is class workshop, and actually Carla and Willie are students there.
Okay, so
it's on intercultural communication.
Intercultural communication.
Yeah.
Okay, and
which is something that I came, I will say, after travel literature, or a consequence of working in travel literature.
Well, I have to say that it was not easy for me to find this kind of topic. It's like a specific topic, so it was a little bit difficult also for me to figure out what it was about. Well, as we know, let us know if it's true. You have two books, right, Doctor? You have two books. The first one is Otras intenciones, otras miradas, textos complementarios a una excursión a los indios ranqueles. Río Cuarto, un río. Y el segundo, que es Nuevas tierras con viejos ojos, viajeros españoles y latinoamericanos en Sudamérica. Is that true? You have those two books that is about travel literature in South America.
Yes, and actually it's the other way around. The second one is the first one that it was based on my dissertation for my doctorate, and the second one I just published it in 2017, but basically and I have also published several articles about travel literature. The topic is so broad, there are so much to talk about it, as Nathaniel here knows, that it's a little bit difficult how to, I will say, put limits to what we can study to, and it's a topic that, as you say, is not an usual field in the study of literature, a genre that not everybody knows about or pay attention to it. But I will say, since, I started working on travel literature when I wrote my dissertation, at that time it was even more obscure, I will say, but now it's becoming more and more common, for example, to find sessions at literature conferences on travel literature, even whole conferences on travel literature. So it's difficult to find, but if you look for it, you will find it.
Right. And also, looking for some research about the topic, it's an interesting one because you can find a lot of books or research, and it's travel literature around the world. So you can find a lot of, if you look for a lot of information. Also, the people right now, it's like asking, what is travel literature, right? What is that? So let's talk about that.
To be completely honest, we didn't know what it was.
I imagine that.
We had to ask around.
Yeah.
So, travel narratives are first-hand accounts, observation that a person makes when traveling. What is your personal definition of the genre?
Oh, that's a very difficult question, but basically, and for that I use partially a definition that comes from the definition of autobiography. Autobiography, which is another genre that usually we don't pay much attention when we talk about literature, and is an account of usually in first person, which is non-fictional. So basically, we have to. Well, this is another topic: the lies that the travelers tell, right? But basically, we have to assume that is that the person was there when he was traveling, and is usually in prose, right? Is not, and is a narrative that describes the travels that the narrator did to a specific place. And from that, of course, you have a lot of different variations, right, Nathaniel?
Right. Yeah. So my era of focus is a little different from yours. I do more 20th century, and in the specifically during the modernist period. So for people who aren't familiar with that term, in the say starting in the teens and then through the 20s and 30s, and I looked at U.S. writers in Mexico, and they're in that era where it's really a hybrid. So when you say, well, we don't know if it's we have to assume that it's nonfiction. We have to assume they were there. But a lot of you also have to think about who the narrator is and what is in that period. It was an exciting period to look at people traveling to Mexico, right? Because they had their own ideas about modernity and industrialization, and the ways of travel were changing too, whether it was automobiles and trains and that sort of thing. So I mean, I would yeah, I think the base definition that we have is good, but then it always, I mean, with technology of travel, how we define travel is changing, and then who is the author? Are they a journalist who went to talk about a culture, right, or to talk about a war, right, and then they end up writing about their travels as well? I mean, how the different things are all woven together. So it can be really broad, right? I don't know. Am I answering the question? Or for me, it's an exciting topic to talk about because it's
what you say is right, because actually you have, in some cases, there are many famous writers that we know because of their novels or their poetry or their short stories that also wrote travel literature, and usually are the books that are the less known books but in many cases, actually, travel literature was written by travelers who went on these trips for very different reasons. For in the case of the part of the world that I specialize in is Latin America, mostly South America. Basically, you have from journalists, but also you have people who went on missions sent by the government, either military missions or as ambassadors, diplomatic missions. You have people who were traveling for business, especially at the time in which they were prospecting for new businesses. If there are especially in Argentina, Chile, there are a lot of mining engineers that were trying to do business on mining or prospecting for companies. Also, you have missionaries. There are a lot of travel literature written by missionaries that went basically to convert the natives. And I'm sure I'm missing some.
Some of my favorite examples of extranjeros traveling in Mexico and writing about that are archaeologists and anthropologists.
I forgot.
In Guatemala and the Yucatan region, right? And so in the 19th century, some of the first stories and accounts of what today is for us some of the most famous things, right? Chichen Itza and Uxmal, and also ecological expeditions, scientific expeditions.
I was going to say
Yeah.
that I just forgot one of the most important ones, the naturalists, the scientific expeditions of the, especially in the case of Latin America of the 18th and early 19th centuries, were especially important regarding the production of travel literature. And of course, when we talk about Latin America, we have to start thinking that some of the cronistas de Indias, the chroniclers of the conquest, are kind of borderline with travel literature. We have to wonder if Cristobal Columbus diaries are travel literature, and to a point, they are. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, like you said, a lot of these are less known works by very famous writers. So then you can think about how some of this stuff, some of their travel journals or diaries or narratives, then sort of form the basis, the raw material for a novel or something like that. So in one of my classes that I teach here, we were just talking about John Steinbeck and the log from the Sea of Cortez, which is a scientific expedition in the Gulf of California, over by the Baja Peninsula. And it was from that narrative of travel account, he also, when he was traveling, he learned the story of the Pearl, right? And the Pearl is one of his most famous short stories, and it's adopted from an old folk tale about a pearl diver who finds an enormous pearl, and that he thinks it's a blessing, but it ends up being a curse, and it's a moral tale. But he learned one of his most famous stories. He learned when he was traveling. Yeah. And Anyway, so there's lots that we can talk about. But
would that since I'm not an expert like you guys, would that story of the pearl would count as travel literature?
So I think that would count as more of sort of a short story, or a parable. Yeah. But it finds its influence, and he talks about learning that story in his travel literature.
Okay.
So his travel log or his travel journal sort of turns into, provides inspiration for his further work, I would say.
Okay. And why was it mentioned that we have to discuss whether Columbus literature is travel literature or not?
Because usually it's not classified as that.
Okay.
But if you look at it, because it's a diary of travel, which but my point is that there are some books that are straight classified as travel literature, and actually my second book, which is related to Una excursión a los indios Ranqueles, this is basically considered the most canonical travel literature book in Argentinian literature. But when you go to, as you know, there are always university professors with nothing to do but to classify things. And when you go to the histories of Latin American literature, you are going to find this whole period called the Cronistas de Indias. And on that, some of those books are mostly a collection of stories, history, etc., about the conquest, and some of them are narrated in a way as travel literature. And that's the case of Columbus, in which he said, this day, this specifically thing happens. The thing is that the genre as itself, I will say the modern version of what we consider travel literature, started in the 18th century, what is called the Grand Tour. When the British aristocracy, it was part of the raising of the young people. They have to travel to the continent, they have to travel to Europe to visit the it was kind of the study abroad of the moment, right? To visit the classic world, and they wrote these stories, and that's when kind of that the travel literature that it had been happening from, I guess, from the first time that somebody left their village and went to the village next door and came back and told the story from there. But it was with the Grand Tour that some of the conventions of modern travel literature were kind of set. But from there, of course, we have so many variations, and of course, also we are talking. For example, when we talk about travel literature, we try to focus mostly on the Western tradition. But in Asia, in the Middle East, in Northern Africa, there was also a very strong tradition of travel literature too.
It's interesting. Well, for me, it's interesting that you mentioned like some authors that are not, maybe they are not known for writing this type of genre. Because when I was doing some research, I found out George Orwell wrote this, and it was really interesting for me because I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So, are there any authors that inspire you to write travel literature?
Well, I don't write travel literature. I study travel literature. I would love to write it, but at some points I try some things, but I never publish anything. And the thing is that you will see a lot of famous authors that wrote travel literature, and in many cases it was done kind of for business. During the 19th century especially, it was a common practice for the newspapers to hire a famous writer like Mark Twain, for example, in the case of the United States. In the case of Argentina, for example, there were also travel literature was very popular, so they will pay a famous writer. A newspaper will pay a famous writer to go to another country and send their impressions of travel that published in the newspapers, kind of a cultural supplement, let's call it this way. So, and then in some cases, in many cases, those writings that were done weekly, usually, were compiled into books. For example, I just sent last week an article for publication about a writer, an American writer, probably you don't know her, Frances Parkinson Case. She was a very, very well-known novelist that kind of published bestsellers in the first half of the 20th century, and she was the wife of a famous senator, American senator, and she published in the Good Housekeeping magazine, which was a very popular magazine. And she did a trip to Europe, to Spain, Portugal, and Latin America. And she was every month in Good Housekeeping magazine. There was an article written by her about her travels, and then they were compiled into a book. And that is it was a very common practice.
So from being an entry in a journal, it became a book.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice.
To compile them, and so those entries become chapters, and
Nice.
you know, I mean, they edited and stuff, but
Wow.
and then
So, would you think that? What do you need to? Well, we'll go to a break, and we'll come back with more questions because we have a lot, right? So we'll be back in a sec.
¿Te gustaría crear o mejorar dispositivos para el servicio de seres vivos, tales como prótesis, órtesis e instrumental biomédico? ¿Qué estás esperando? La Escuela de Ingeniería Biónica de la UPAEP te invita a conocer cómo un ingeniero biónico domina y aplica las habilidades de elementos mecánicos, electrónicos y biológicos en las personas. Conoce nuestro plan de estudios conformado por 9 cuatrimestres con líneas terminales en diseño y manufactura de prótesis, emprendedores e instrumentación biomédica, con un campo de trabajo que va desde el sector salud, automotriz y aeroespacial. Para más información, comunícate al teléfono 229-9400, extensión 7146, o consulta la página www.upaep.mx. Ingeniería biónica, calidad de vida en tus manos. Hazlo tuyo. Hazlo UPAEP.
Soy de Tabasco, tengo 21 años y estudio la licenciatura en Comercio y Estrategia Internacional en UPAEP. Practiqué baile contemporáneo y esto me formó como una persona muy apasionada y detallista. Amo la música y por eso estuve aprendiendo batería en Bellas Artes UPAEP. Mi gran inspiración es mi mamá. Es una emprendedora social y me enseñó que lo más importante es poner el corazón en lo que hago. En UPAEP lo estoy logrando porque me forman con los mismos valores que ella me inculcó. Mejorar mi entorno es uno de mis sueños y por eso estoy colaborando en 2 proyectos que promueven la vida sustentable. Estoy determinada que el impacto que deje en el mundo sea el inicio de la transformación que nuestro futuro necesita. Mi historia comienza aquí. Soy Karen y soy UPAEP.
What have you heard about Mexico these days? Feeling tired? According to International Living, Mexico is 4th among the top 10 best locations to retire. We're top of the class. Mexico holds one of the world's leading places of engineering graduates. And by the way, we're also home to the oldest university in North America. And it's all happening in Mexico as we speak. Find out for yourself.
And we're back for more of Culture Shock, right? So we were discussing what world literature is, and Dr. Tuninetti and Nathaniel were like giving more insight into this. And well, what we found, and correct us if we're wrong, right? But we also found that it became popular. Travel literature became popular in China, right? Around 960 to 1279. And it was medieval China, right? And it became very, very popular with all these travels. And well, yeah, they've written in narrative, prose, essay, and diary style. And this is where the different styles of the writers, I guess, come into play, right? How would you say? I'm just thinking of one very great traveler, which I suppose wrote a lot, Marco Polo, right?
Mm-hmm. I don't. That's yeah. I don't know much about the.
Okay. But let's say then Columbus, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
And what is a South American very well-known writer?
Well, actually, for example, well, one of the issues with travel literature is that it's very difficult to put the use the places or regions as categories, because if you have a Mexican writer going to Europe and writing about his travels on Spain,
Okay.
and you have a Spanish writer coming to Mexico and writing about her travels in Mexico, what travel literature? What of these books are Spanish travel literature or Mexican travel literature? And so, for example, when you think about Latin America, the 2 most famous, internationally most famous travel writers will be Darwin, Charles Darwin, who was British, and Alexander von Humboldt, who was German, right? But they wrote about Latin America, and basically their writing helped to define and understand and see Latin America as we see it today, but they weren't Latin Americans.
And they went to different places.
And they went to different places, exactly. So that will be one way of looking at things.
Okay.
And the other way, for example, in the case of Latin American travel literature in many countries, and actually I'm not very sure about Mexico, but in the case of South America, for example, in Argentina, but also in Chile, it happened a little bit the same thing that we were talking about the Grand Tour, that in the case of England and Europe, that for the upper class young people, especially from the families that hold the power, going to Europe was part of their education, and they wrote about that. And some of those books become very important to understand their own countries. Okay. And basically, and also it was a way of saying, oh well, I was there, and therefore I can talk about this, which is a little bit like the issue that I was mentioning before about autobiography. Who writes his or her autobiography? Somebody who believes that it's important enough that for the other people would like to know about their lives. Yeah. And with the issue of travel literature, it happens a little bit the same thing, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I think it's. I mean, again, you always have to consider the. Yeah, in the case of my area of study with writers from the United States coming to Mexico, are they interested in Mexico primarily, or are they interested in getting away from the United States to step back and take a better look at the United States, right? Or are they interested in it's usually a combination of both, but you can't saying, oh, well, you know, the context of world events, right, is always, and of course the United States and Mexico have a very complicated relationship.
So we can say that world literature is a very hard term to enclose into a definition, right? Because it's very broad. A lot of things intervene, and a lot of things affect its definition, right? So, well, what if we go and listen to the community in UPAEP and see what they think about travel literature? If they know what it is, what are their, why do you think if it's important, or what does it come to their minds when they listen to travel literature? So let's go to the Vox Populi and we'll be back.
Amigos de Culture Shock, hoy vamos a hablar sobre la literatura de viajes. Vamos a verlo.
Hola, ¿puedes decirme qué es la literatura?
Bueno, yo considero que la literatura involucra todo lo que aquellas personas escriben o transmiten por medio de la escritura.
¿Sabes qué es la literatura de viajes?
No exactamente. No.
¿Alguna idea que tengas?
Bueno, me suena con literatura que llevas cuando viajas o alguna cosa así.
¿Qué tipos de literatura conoces?
Pues no mucha. Creo que... Bueno, no sé si estoy en lo correcto, pero podría ser, no sé, de romance, de suspenso, novelas o cosas así.
Ok, gracias.
Hola, ¿qué es la literatura?
La literatura es un medio de expresión en el que tú escribes ciertas ideas para que quieres darle a conocer al mundo, ya sean más subjetivas u objetivas respecto de cosas científicas o hechos.
¿Qué crees que sea la literatura de viajes?
Se me ocurre que es de cuando los viajeros hacían sus viajes, va la redundancia, y iban escribiendo los relatos que ellos iban consiguiendo con ello. Se me ocurre eso.
¿Cuál crees que sea su importancia?
Pues para dar a conocer al mundo cómo es que se iban suscitando los descubrimientos, lo que iban viendo y lo que iba siendo nuevo para ellos.
Gracias.
Hola, ¿sabes qué es la literatura?
Sí, bueno, para mí la literatura es más que nada lo que sabemos sobre nuestro origen, sobre las cosas relacionadas con pues con nuestro entorno, con la sociedad, con pues sobre todo lo que nos rodea. Pues siento que para mí esa es la literatura, lo que nos enseñan.
¿Qué tipos de literatura conoces?
Por ejemplo, pues la histórica, la romántica, más que nada esas.
¿Qué crees que sea la literatura de viajes?
La literatura de viajes, no sé, me suena como a lo que se sabe sobre otros lugares a donde hemos ido o donde se han encontrado cosas diferentes o cosas que nos que repercutan en nosotros.
Ok, gracias.
Hola, ¿qué es literatura?
Pues pienso que es como el estudio de las letras, como un arte de letras.
¿Y tú?
Yo pienso que es igual un arte como el comprender acerca de las cosas muy a fondo.
¿Qué crees que sea la literatura de viajes?
Yo creo que cuando alguien se realiza un viaje y trata de pasarlo a lo escrito, como redactar su experiencia.
¿Y tú?
No, bueno, la verdad es que pienso que es igual que son experiencias de la gente que viaja y así.
¿Qué otros tipos de literatura conoces?
Pues yo creo que hay varios tipos, como ya sea de suspenso o de tipo romántico o de acción, no sé.
¿Y tú?
Romántica, clásico, natural.
Gracias.
Okay, and we're back. So, what do we think about this?
I think that's a really hard question.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
What is literature?
I have been studying literature for 40 years, and if somebody comes to me and asks, what is literature? I will have a very hard time replying.
So all of those who had a hard time answering.
When we were planning this one, we were like, what can we ask, right? What can we ask to the community? And we were,
But I was also impressed. But I mean, even if people hadn't read travel literature, they had. I mean,
they have a very clear
idea. They have an idea,
yeah.
right? And I mean, as broad as the definition is, and sort of has to be.
Yeah.
They have a good idea, and who knows? Maybe some of them will go to the bookstore and start looking for some travel literature after.
Well, that's a very interesting. That you mentioned going to the bookstore. That's a very interesting phenomenon. That if you think that now, of course, travel literature played a role when there was no internet, no television, and basically, and not a lot of people have the opportunity to travel. But now that travel is more common, a lot more people have the opportunity to travel, and basically we can access anywhere through virtually. Well, there are no region in the world in which National Geographic hasn't done a documentary, and travel literature is still a very popular genre, and there is still a lot of books written on travel literature. A lot of people feeling this need to write about their travel experiences, and I don't even want to go into the number of blogs that there are regarding travel literature. Or now, well, also YouTubers, right? It has become also...
That's one of our questions, right? Like, we wanted to ask that, if this counts as travel literature, does it count to have your YouTube channel? Does it count, like, can anyone just go travel and write their experiences? Or are there any limitations, guidelines that you have to follow? What about these Instagrammers or these people that with technology, right?
Because nowadays there's this term, traveler, celebrity traveler. Do you consider it like a writer? Can anyone write travel literature if they want?
I mean, I think anybody can keep a travel journal or a travel blog or a travel. I would say, I mean, I don't want to be a snob about it, right? But I think, I think that when it becomes literature, and I'm not talking about literature with a capital L, you know, very important, high culture, blah blah blah. But when something qualifies as literature, there, I guess what I'm trying to say is in a blog, in a YouTube traveler, celebrity Instagram travelers or whatever. I think there you might have sort of the raw material for literature, but then I mean the process of then converting that into a coherent narrative. I mean, I would say that there is something in the blogs, and some might be better written than others and more. I guess what I'm looking for, the word craft, right? That it's been crafted and not just a picture and I'm in Puerto Escondido. Right?
And that's it.
So that I don't think would qualify.
It's awesome.
Right. Puerto Escondido is awesome, right? I don't think that qualifies as literature, right? So I don't know about, but I think you might have raw material, and then you might have some that are crafting it, and then you might have some that then would go steps further, I suppose.
So I think it has to be meaningful, not only for the person that is writing something, it has to be meaningful for others, right?
Yeah.
So if it's important for you, if you think it's good for you, but you have to think in the others, right? If it's good for you, it has to be good and important for the others, so they can learn something. Right?
Yeah, and also, well, basically, a very basic answer to the question will be: anybody can write poetry. If the poetry is good or bad, and it deserves to be published or not, that's a completely different question.
And a very difficult question as well.
But again, anybody can write poetry. Now, something that I see happening now, for example, with this issue of the blogs, is that kind of a reversal. In the history of travel literature, at the beginning, a part of the narrative used to be to provide advice to future travelers. So basically, if you another subgenre on travel literature in medieval Europe, for example, was the narratives written by monks who were traveling on doing pilgrimage, for example, and part of those narratives was to say, oh, well, in this specific town, there is a good place to stay and they serve good food. Let's put it this way. And in the first half of the 19th century, there was a very important split that started in Germany and in England, in which because people started to travel more, and some writers discovered that there was a market for the travel guides. So the travel guide, as we know it today, was born. The travel guide that you can go, and well, we go to the internet now, but you still can find them in the bookstore, in which you will have a list of hotels and restaurants and places to visit, etc., which means that travel literature was basically relieved from the needs to provide specific advice. But now, with the blogs, we are going back to that part of saying, oh, well, I want to show that I am a good writer, but also I want to say this place is worth visiting for this and this and that, and you shouldn't eat at that place because the tortillas are stale.
Go ahead. No, that just reminds me, you mentioned, because in the bookstore, at least in a lot of bookstores in the United States, you go to the travel section, and I can buy a guidebook that will for Mexico or for Argentina or for any number of countries, right? And sometimes alongside those books, right? For example, if talking about South America, section on guidebooks for South America. And among those, you'll see Bruce Chatwin's In Patagonia, right? So which is not about a book about advice for traveling in Patagonia. It's about his experience living in a very remote part of the earth. But I think there's also an impulse for travelers to say, if I'm going to go to this place, I should read about it first. And I should read about somebody's whether it was an experience in the 19th
Yeah.
century or in the mid
But
1950s.
I don't know here in Mexico,
Okay.
but for example, in Spain,
Mhm.
if you go to the big bookstores in Spain,
Mm-hmm.
like the bookstore of El Corte Inglés or La Casa del Libro, you will see two separate sections.
Okay.
One on literatura de viajes and another one on guías de
Okay.
viajes.
In the United States, they tend to be
Yeah.
they tend to be smushed together.
Yeah.
Or
So-
sometimes the travel literature will be in essays or something.
Yeah.
Also, well, as we can see, it's a wide concept, right?
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of concepts in travel literature. So could you say there are like subgenres in the main, like in the main concept of travel literature?
Oh yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some of them, like Chatwin, that are we could consider them high literature. But if you go, for example, to the section of travel literature, as I was saying, in a bookstore in Spain, you will find, for example, the literature written by journalists. And there are actually some writers and journalists that became famous for their narratives of travel. But also, for example, now there is a new genre that I am particularly not very fond of, but all this travel literature written by, I don't know, I call it the adrenaline travel literature, which is basically kind of say, oh, I swam the whole Amazon River and among piranhas, or I crossed the Sahara Desert barefoot. Yeah, and also the travel literature of let's call it self-discovery, which the most famous is the Eat,
Pray, Love.
Eat, Pray, Love. Basically, the idea of the Western, and by Western I mean American or Northern European traveler that go to a third world country or a southern European country like Spain or Italy or Greece, and they learn how to live and how to relax and let the stress of the civilization go and discover themselves. So again, there are all these things.
But you started to ask a question earlier, Carla.
Well, it's not a question, but it's like an opinion. This might be a little controversial, but from what you said before about travel literature being for advice, can you compare it to TripAdvisor nowadays?
Well, that TripAdvisor will be the equivalent of the travel guides.
Which is a subgenre or not?
So it's a different genre.
Okay.
Because travel guides are not written. Basically, the idea that we have in travel literature is that there is an author, and that author is a person that we identify as the voice of the person who is doing that trip. The travel guides are usually done by a team. There is nobody, because basically, if in traditional, let's say, if Mark Twain went to England and say something funny or obnoxious about the British, you take that as part of the you take that as part of Mark Twain's writing. Meanwhile, the travel guide doesn't have the voice of an author, but is basically a collection of information that you either trust or not according to your or your experience with that guy. Basically,
well, and it's interesting to me because the motive of the travel guide is to sell travel guides. And a lot of the unspoken or the open secret of a lot of those guides is that the restaurants or the hotels listed have, if not paid directly, they as if it's an advertisement, they have they invited this team to stay there and to write about them. Maybe the team ranks them really high or maybe it ranks them really low, but they're in the book. right? And so, and I mean, TripAdvisor, you know, suggests that everything is by verified travelers, but I recently was in Puerto Escondido, for instance, right? And the guy at the restaurant says, "Oh, can you give us a review on? Make sure, don't forget to give a review on TripAdvisor." And I said, "Sure, I'd love to do that." He said, "And if you do, like, I'll give you a free shot of mezcal." I said, "Well, then, you know, so they're all,
Yeah.
And you get this. I mean, you never. I mean, and that's another thing about the internet and blogs and
Yeah.
the identity, even if it's by, you know, Joe Schmo, you know, who was in Puerto Escondido, you know, and gives a great review to a hotel and a restaurant. You don't know if Joe Schmo is actually Joe Schmo. It could be, you know, it could be Bill Smith.
Anyway, yeah.
Anyway, it could be anybody.
Bill Smith.
Right,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
the anonymity, right,
Yeah.
of the travel guide, I think is still, but it's interesting because TripAdvisor sort of pretends that it doesn't do that, but, you know,
Oh, yeah.
you never know.
Yeah, and actually there is a whole, and I did an experiment last year. I saw an ad promoting online courses to learn how to write, to do travel writing. And they were giving scholarships to do it for free. So I applied. And I got a scholarship. and I have to write, of course, they ask you to write something. I wrote something and I sent it, and I got the scholarship. And because I was interested to see how this work. Well, one of the interesting things is that the two supervisors of the writing program, probably between the two of them did an amount of 45 years of age, because they were not teenagers, but people in their 20s. And it was this idea of writing and basically, get invited to visit this hotel and travel for free, and in exchange for that, you will write a review of them. Or go to this restaurant and eat for free, and you will have to write a paragraph that it will show on a specific guide, this kind of thing.
Which, of course, is very biased, right?
Of course it's biased.
Because you're being, you're being bribed.
Exactly, yeah. Well, basically, if you think about a famous writer who was paid by the newspaper to travel and write about it, the issue of compensation for travel writing has been always there in a way or another. And in the same way that the issue of impartiality or the issue of political agendas. For example, there are a lot of writers, American writers from the first half of the 20th century going to Latin America, that basically they are promoting and reproducing the good neighborhood policy of the 30s and 40s, right? So again, it's a complicated, in some cases it's more obvious, in other cases it isn't, but in travel writing there is always an agenda in general.
Okay. Well, we're going to go to a very short break, and we'll be back for the final section of Culture Shock.
La leucemia es la principal causa de muerte por enfermedad de niños de 5 a 14 años. En UPAEP queremos transformar esta realidad. Un grupo de estudiantes de diferentes posgrados estamos desarrollando un proyecto que busca identificar nuevos marcadores moleculares de leucemia. Esta investigación es conducida por la doctora Rocío Baños del Centro de Investigación Oncológica Una Nueva Esperanza UPAEP. Con este proyecto participamos en 2 convocatorias. La primera en la Universidad de San Diego, la cual nos sirvió mucho para afinar nuestro proyecto. La segunda fue en Tsinghua University, en China. donde concursamos 67 equipos de todo el mundo y solo pasamos 11. Trabajamos mucho durante 2 semanas y al final valió la pena. Resultamos ganadores del primer lugar y obtuvimos apoyo para seguir con nuestro proyecto. Mi historia se transforma con cada acción que emprendo. Aún me falta mucho por contar. Soy David y soy UPAEP.
Okay, and we're back. And well, we've talked about world literature and how many things it encompasses, right? And it's just very, very interesting, and it's getting even more. And now, Carla and Willie will talk about like how it expands even more, right?
Well, now let's talk about how culture shock influences in travel literature. That, as we have seen in the class with with Dr. Tuninetti, it has a lot of relation. It can have a lot of relation, right? So let's talk about a bit about this. What role does culture shock play in the literature of travel? What do you think about you guys? What do you think about this?
I mean, I think a lot of times what a writer is doing, either either keeping a diary or actively writing, either personally or actively writing for an audience, maybe to go back to the issue of a blog, right, or the question of a blog. I think a lot of what writing does in that sense is to sort of think through issues of cultural difference, right? I'm here, and wow, it's incredible, and I want to try to understand why, or I thought this was going to be such a great trip, and it's a nightmare, and the people who live here are crazy, and I am lost, and I'm uncomfortable, and I'm scared. So I think a lot of times writing, helps you to navigate and to try to process an experience. I guess I would. And so, culture shock is always a part of travel.
And actually, some of the best writing comes from culture shock and from things not going the way you expect them. And actually, I have been working on international education and dealing with students studying abroad, which is the way basically from travel literature. I always have been very interested in travel, and I started working on international education and international relations between universities, helping developing study abroad programs, these kind of things. And when a student has a problem during a study abroad trip, for example, I always tell them, well, this is what you are going to remember 20 years from now, not the things that went perfectly, because if you travel, you will see that the trips that everything goes perfectly, you had a great time, but after a few years, you forgot about it. But the time that you lost your wallet and you have to walk 10 kilometers because you didn't have money for a taxi, and your phone didn't have battery, so you couldn't call an Uber, is the time that you are going to remember forever, and it's going to be a funny anecdote. And in a way, that's culture shock, and that's also what happened with many writers. Is those things that find shocking, different, is what makes the writing interesting.
So could be, could be like included this topic of culture shock in travel literature? Because, well, as we know, culture shock, it has to be a lot of steps to go through to have and to feel, and at the end, to feel comfortable in the country or in the place.
Can we observe this in some of these travel literature?
Yeah,
these different stages.
I mean, I've never really thought about it in those terms. Neither
I mean,
that might be an interesting sort of. I mean, I guess it would depend on the book, right? Because, well, refresh me. So and I don't want to put you guys on the spot, but I mean, I sort of vaguely remember sort of the steps, but what are the exact steps of culture shock?
The first one is when you arrive and you are like amazed by everything.
Honeymoon.
Oh, the honeymoon, okay.
You say, okay, everything is going to be okay, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
But then you realize that, okay, I have to adapt myself to everything, the lifestyle,
so honeymoon,
the place.
Adaptation, isolation
first,
and shock,
denial, isolation,
and then adaptation.
Okay, so it starts with honeymoon, and then it ends with adaptation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Going, of course, through the isolation part,
so that,
denial.
Is there like a, because that, I mean, if you're traveling for like a week or 2 weeks, you're not going to go through all of that. It's just going to be honey. So is there like a time frame or?
Well, I don't think there's like something set,
Yeah.
but yeah, if it's a week or two, I don't think it's
No,
gonna
no.
happen.
No, usually for a semester,
Yeah,
let's
that
say
could
when
probably happen.
an experience of a semester or a year, you go through all the stages.
Okay. Yeah.
But if you go for 10 days, and also it depends why are you going to a place.
Right, yeah.
But a small, I will say, instances of cultural shocks always happen, and it doesn't matter how often do you
Right,
travel.
okay.
If you go to a different culture, you are always going to find some bumps on the road
Right, of course,
regarding
yeah.
culture shock.
No, it seems, I guess it would be interesting
To see it from that point. right?
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to sort of apply some of that stuff to, a longer, maybe a book length narrative of travel. You know, and,
I never thought about it.
But
there's a very interesting question that I want to ask before we go. Is travel literature ever complicit in perpetuating stereotypes? How can it have these unintentional?
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And a lot of travel literature is written by authors that already have an idea of what they want to see, and they perpetuate those stereotypes.
Yeah, that's
Definitely.
true.
There are some that know, and basically,
Are there
and
some that change their opinion?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
definitely, and there are some that change, and start to see the world with different eyes, but it's the same. Yeah, basically, any intercultural encounter, you can go with your own stereotypes and read it just following those stereotypes and not being able to see behind those. And there are some people who are able to change. Yeah.
And I think,
the people who,
no, I think sometimes people are motivated to travel because of stereotypes. They say, "Oh, I want to go to that place or that region to see this."
If it's true. Or
Yeah,
not.
and
Okay.
or but not even to see if it's true, because they're going there. They're going there to maybe check off a box, right?
Okay.
And to say this is on my list, I'm going to go see that. And then sometimes maybe the shock might be that they encounter something that they didn't expect, or they didn't want to see, and so then there's a lot
And
of
that's- yeah,
rationalization and things like that.
And just to go, Nathaniel and Dr. Toninetti, any advice for people who want to start in this travel literature world?
Well, I also don't write. I've tried and I never submit anything. But I guess just write it, and just don't be afraid of what you write. You might not like.
And read.
Yeah,
Read
and
a
read
lot.
as well.
And there are a lot of great things you read. There are a lot of fun, well-written things. Yeah, so.
I'm gonna get my scholarship. I'm gonna apply for that. Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you to our audience for tuning in every Tuesday, and thank you guys also. Well, we'll be back next week with more of Culture Shock, and thank you, Dr. Trinity, for being our
Thank you
host
for coming.
twice.
Thank you very
right?
much.
So, thank you, and we'll be back next week. See ya, guys.